Inside the envelope was a key on a plain silver ring and a short letter. The paper smelled faintly of attic dust and his aftershave, the same cedar and citrus that lingered in his shirts. He wrote with his usual economy, each sentence a small country road that went straight to where it wanted. "If the house ever leaves you and you didn't agree," his note began, "there's a safety box at Harbor Trust with number 4072. The box has instructions in it. Don't let them make you think smaller. Love, R." I read the line twice, then a third time, as if the rhythm of the sentence would lock meaning into the letters. He had left me away to look after the thing that mattered most to me, because he had suspected, perhaps because he had known, that there were hands too quick and minds too clever to value what we'd made. The key was cold in my palm, and it felt suddenly heavy with possibility. I didn't tell anyone I had the envelope. I didn't tell Aurora or Mrs. Johnson from the thrift where I sometimes worked afternoons folding shirts. I folded the note back into the manila and set both into my apron pocket as if they were lit votive candles. I went to Harbor Trust that morning with my purse and a little tremor in my feet, and the bank clerk led me to the back where the safety deposit boxes crouched like a community of small stone houses. The metal key clicked against the lock, and behind the tiny door, in a blue velvet lining, were two things: a folded will in Robert's hand, clear and canonical, and a small folder of papers, bank statements, and a deed with a seal I did not recognize at first. The deed was not for Seabright, as we owned it. It was a set of documents indicating a small trust Robert had set up 5 years earlier, funds designated to maintain Seabright and to be used for its care should the need arise. There were also photographs: Robert with his arm around me on the porch, the truck in the driveway with sand behind its tires, a small picture of Angela when she was little, gripping a sand pail like she was holding the world. And under those, tucked like a secret within a secret, was another envelope, thinner, that contained copies of correspondence, letters and a printout of an email trail involving Angela and a man named Edward, her husband, about the sale to a buyer in the next county. The dates were recent, the signatures were not mine. That afternoon, I sat on the porch until the stars came out. I cupped the key between my palms and read Robert's letter until the edges softened. He had done 1,000 little things without announcing them, planning for risks I had not wanted to name. I had been grieving and proud and so sure of how our life should look that I had not imagined treachery from the ones closest to us. I called Mr. Peterson that evening because Mr. Peterson had been my father's lawyer and had handled 100 matters with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent his life preserving people's private dignities.
The office smelled of leather and coffee and paper. He listened to me without interrupting. "Bring what you have," he said when I finished. "Don't confront them. Let me look. There are protocols for this." You do not feel betrayed in neat cinematic beats. It is a slow pooling, like water finding the low place in a room. I felt small flashes, anger at Angela's voice when she used to skip the farewell at the door, a memory of dishes left in the sink, of promises to visit that never were kept. But the deeper current was sorrow. For years, I had thought entitlement was a fault of the young. Now I saw that grief had a way of making people forget their vows. I kept these thoughts to myself. My strategy was not to shout the betrayal from the roof. It was to build a quiet place for truth to be seen. The next weeks were a study in patient motion. Mr. Peterson and I met in his back office, where he set the papers between us like bones to be read. He spoke in careful legalese, the way someone speaks in a language not meant to be ornate. The deed recorded today appears to have some irregularities, he said, tapping a printed copy. There's a power of attorney executed shortly after Robert's hospital stay. It's suspicious. The signature doesn't match his hand on file, and the transfer was rushed through with an expedited clerk's stamp. We can challenge the transfer on the grounds of forgery and undue influence. Words like forgery and undue influence felt sharp and useful, and at the same time cold. I had imagined a courtroom with lights and dramatic gestures. Instead, there was Mr. Peterson closing the folder and saying, "We begin with an injunction to freeze the sale proceeds. We'll need proof of the trust, proof of the will, and evidence that you did not authorize any transaction." He leaned back and regarded me the way one regards a person carrying a fragile animal. "Antonia," he said, "what do you want to do when we can stop them?" The truth there was heavier than the legal terms. I wanted my house back, yes. I wanted the porch sweeps and the faint varnish-edged memories of breakfast light. But more than that, I wanted the betrayal to lead somewhere that mattered, education rather than spectacle. I did not want to ruin Angela. I wanted to teach her. I wanted her to learn with her own two hands what it meant to steward what you were given. We moved quickly, but with a kind of care. Mr. Peterson filed for an injunction. The purchaser, it turned out, was a small development group who had bought the property in good faith. The county clerk grudgingly put a hold on the transfer. There were phone calls that made my head swim. Edward's voice was oily on the recordings Mr. Peterson had obtained. If I pictured him at all, it was as someone who had been comfortable with edges for a long time. Angela's name was on emails and transfers. She had signed off on certain documents, but the signature on the resale deed? Not mine.
Da injunção frozou os sale funds e o purchaser, blindsided and annoyed, agreed to a temporary holding arrangement. Mr. Peterson arranged for a mediator. Angela took the job at the diner, hands learning the choreography of plates and orders, her shoulders growing less tense as the hours passed. She was clumsy at first, dropping a cup, miscounting a till. And then, slowly, she became steady. Mrs. Johnson had a way of speaking to her that wasn't pity. You learn to do honest work, and it will teach you how to be honest with yourself, she said, and spoke with the kind of blunt affection of women who have boiled beans and tended other people's children. Edward resurfaced like a season's regret. He called once, and she answered in the street between shifts and told him to leave a forwarding address. He threatened legal action, threats thin as tissue. Mr. Peterson answered his calls with the kind of legal gravity that made men like Edward go quiet. He filed motions. He argued with county clerks. The law is tedious and precise, and when it moves with the weight of heavy things. I had to make decisions that surprised people. Friends asked if I wanted to take everything back, to make a public example, to drag Angela's name through the paper. I said no. I wanted learning, not shaming. I wanted Angela to be the person she could be when she saw the cost of what she'd done. I wanted restitution that helped others, not revenge. In the quiet hours, I read Robert's letter again and again. He had predicted little. He had loved much. He had left me a way back to the house if such a thing ever happened, but more than that, he had left instructions for the kind of stewardship he believed in. There was a sentence near the end of his brief note that steadied me. If you ever must teach with steel, teach with kindness under it. I kept that like a rule for this season. There were moments of temptation, small and human. I would see Angela at the diner, wiping down a table, her hair tucked under a band, and feel a hot, sharp flare of what I could only call the ancient desire to smite. But then I would look at the way she carried the trash out without complaint and remember the girl who used to bring me wildflowers from the highway. The sound of her laugh came back sometimes, low and shell-shaped. Mercy had to be careful, but it had to be real. One afternoon, a messenger from the bank handed me a thick envelope marked confidential. Inside were photographs Mr. Peterson had obtained, documents that showed the timeline of transfers, emails that proved Angela into signing certain things after promising a quick sale to remove them from debt, assurances of security that had turned into a cascade of withdrawals. The more we saw, the more it became clear Edward had been the engine of the betrayal, the one who fed Angela lies about speed and safety and necessity until she could no longer see the shape of truth. You show them the need. You show them the plan. You show them the people who will see it through. Angela watched Ruth as if watching a ritual. For months, she had been half afloat in a life that sometimes felt like an ache with a shore she couldn't name. Learning to translate our work into numbers, timelines, and outcomes was a small, steady thing that gave her something to hold. We learned to count nights of shelter, to measure the hours men and women sat at our table and were fed, to estimate the cost of blankets and the price of a volunteer's time. We turned stories into spreadsheets and tenderness into a budget line. Mr. Peterson, who had been slowly losing the habit of calling the law a blunt instrument and had begun to call it a tool for learning, sat across from us and smiled when Angela hesitated over a sentence. He had taught her how to write a mission statement, brief, plain, unpretentious. We will provide temporary shelter and restoration through teaching life skills, legal aid, and community support, she wrote, and then cried a little because the words felt both heavy and possible. The grant, when it was done, smelled of Xerox and coffee. Ruth made a copy for the file, and Mr. Peterson promised to proofread the legal attachments. We sent the application with a careful hand, like anyone sending a letter into a long, uncertain distance. It was months before the reply came, a letter with a folded check and a sentence that recognized our integrated approach to community restoration. When Angela opened the envelope, she stood in the kitchen and laughed in a way that sounded, for a moment, like Edward, sharp and startled, and then gone. There were other quieter lessons. Mr. Peterson began to come to the shelter not as a stranger with briefs, but as a tutor in small things. How to negotiate a lease, how to read a title, how to speak calmly when a letter from a lawyer arrived. He would sit with a stack of legal forms and say, "This is a form. Forms are like recipes. If you know which ingredient you need, the rest becomes easier." His hands, which once fidgeted with the rim of his coffee cup while he spoke about precedent, grew steadier as he practiced patience in the small classroom of our parlor. The buyer, Mr. Carlyle, the man who had purchased the house with plans we had not known of, was, for a long while, a specter of disappointment. He wrote letters that were polite and then less so. He claimed damages that read like arithmetic, inconvenience, lost time, broken plans. There were filings, small and procedural, that arrived in envelopes with thin official language. We met in a mediation room with fluorescent lights and an awkward bowl of mints on the table. Mr. Peterson sat with us. He folded his hands and said,
People come to these rooms with different kinds of grief. The law is the bridge, but someone has to build it. What surprised me was not the buyer's anger, but the way it softened when someone offered him a bowl of stew.
We did not offer an argument so much as a story. A family with no roof, nights of children in cars, a porch light left on for those who had nowhere else to go. He listened, and then, in the way people do in small towns, he started to tell us things about himself. How his mother had loved an old house and lost it. How he had once been young and reckless. By the end of that meeting, he had not rescinded his claim, and we did not surrender the shelter. Instead, he wrote a check for a few of the initial repairs and, later, brought a volunteer crew from a neighboring town to fix the broken fence that kept the dunes drifting on our porch. The lawsuits that followed looked large on paper, but were, in truth, grown from the same roots: misunderstanding, fear, the need to be recognized. One neighbor feared for property values. Another, whose family had once been paid for a right-of-way, feared a loss of legacy. We sat with them. We hosted a potluck and listened to stories of summer picnics and fishing trips. In the end, agreements were reached. Promises were made, not in legalese, but in the form of a commitment to preserve a footpath and to host 2 community cleanups each year. It is remarkable, sometimes, what a casserole can do. Angela's nights were still, however, not free of tide. She would lie awake, and memories of Edward would come like the sea, slow at first, then a pressure that made her mouth dry. Once, in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, she pressed her face to the window and said, "I can still hear him humming when he thought no one could hear." I gave her a mug of tea and sat with her while she let herself name the small, sharp things. There is no neat way to extract grief. There are only the moments when you choose to reach out your hand and let someone else hold it with you. We learned to hold one another. Those hands, when they came together, made other things possible. Aurora's blankets proliferated. We stacked them on a bookshelf and left a note for cold nights. The diner became a hub for volunteers. A retired carpenter fixed our door. A teenager named Jonah, who had been shuffled through foster homes, learned to sand a tabletop until it was smooth and bright. He began to come every Saturday with a box of tools and a look that belonged to someone discovering his usefulness for the first time. On one of those Saturdays, he asked about the stars. "How do you know which is which?" he asked me as we sat on the porch, and his voice was small with wonder. "Pick one point and imagine a line," I said, "then another. Then, with a little making, you have a pattern." I pointed with my finger and drew constellations by naming them simple things: the summer river, the old boat, the needle. The boy, whose name was Jamie, began to call them the names he chose. He taught a friend to recognize Orion from the way the 3 stars at his belt lined up. Those nights, a small crowd gathered on the porch with hot chocolate and blankets and watches that glowed like tiny moons. A lantern swung in the doorway, someone hummed, and for the space of a handful of hours, the world felt both fragile and endless. One evening, a woman came with a child who could not stop talking about boats. She had found our name at a gas station bulletin board and had driven across 2 towns because the shelter had promised a bed for the night. Her son, Marcus, was quiet at first, the way children are when they've had too many moves. On the porch, he looked up and said, "What's that?" and pointed toward the north, where a spread of faint stars lay like freckles across velvet. "Mighty Bear," I said, and Jamie corrected me gently. "That's Ursa Minor, but it's like a bear if you squint." The boy's face lit up, and he pressed closer until his shoulder touched mine. There are small miracles in such moments, the taking of focus off hunger, the exchange of shame for curiosity. Marcus slept that night under Aurora's blanket, and his mother, for the first time in months, breathed like someone who had been allowed a small rest. Not everything gilded over so easily. We had skirmishes with bureaucracy, forms lost in transit, a misfiled checkbox that paused funding for a month, an inspector who arrived on a rainy Thursday and found a safety concern that needed urgent repair. In those hours, I learned the value of showing up early and staying late, of making lists that were not prayers but actions. I learned to answer the phone with patience and to write emails that explained not only our needs but the faces behind them. There were also days when the past intruded in blunt ways. Edward's name would be carved somewhere else into a memory of him that Angela could not reach. A photograph turned up in a box of letters from his mother. A neighbor remembered him in a fishing story and told it with a laugh that felt like a pin. It was in those moments that Angela's hands, which had grown so deft at folding forms and tying bows on donation baskets, would find a loose piece of thread and knit without looking. Grief moves in small rhythms, a hand that cannot stop folding, a person who cannot stop repairing, a child who cannot stop naming stars. One winter, when the harbor sputtered with ice and the sea seemed to have drawn its breath in a long, cold pause, we organized a fundraiser. It was not polished. Tea urns in the diner, a bake sale outside, Jonah's repaired table set as a raffle prize. But it gathered every small generosity we had like a net. Mr. Peterson auctioned off an afternoon of legal advice that he promised to give with no swords, that is, no intimidation, only listening. The buyer, Mr. Carlyle, donated a weekend of landscaping. Aurora knitted extra blankets, and Ruth made a ceramic bowl whose glaze looked like the harbor at dusk. The room was warm with soup and the light of people who wanted to do something right.
No alto de people que wanted to do something right. At the auction, a man stood up in the back and with a voice that trembled offered to teach carpentry to any young person who would show up. He had been a carpenter before the town changed, and he had lost work. He told us, "You gave me a reason to get out of bed. I want to give something back." His hands were calloused and sure as he spoke, and when he sat down, the room applauded like rain. It felt for a while as if everything would be enough. The small boy, the Jamie who learned constellations, grew bolder. He began to help Aurora with the blanket drive, folding them into neat stacks and writing names on the tissue that labeled each bundle. He took pride when someone accepted a blanket with eyes that shone like the porch light. One night he came to me and said, "I think I want to be a teacher." He said it without the coyness of a child making a wish. He said it like someone deciding on a path. I told him he could, and he sat up straighter like someone who had been given permission to move. Through all of it, the porch remained our axis. People came and went, but the porch caught them like a net. Sometimes it caught old men who talked of storms they'd weathered. Sometimes it caught travelers who needed directions. Sometimes it caught mothers who needed to know their children would be safe. The light stayed on because many of us had decided it should. There are decisions that mean very little on paper and everything in life. Months after the legal filings began, the mediator called us to say that the formal claims had been resolved. The buyer signed the release, and we signed terms agreeing to preserve certain aspects of the property for community use. There were fees to be paid and a small fine for an administrative misstep. Mr. Peterson handled the math with a steady hand, and at the end refused his fee. "Consider it tuition," he told Angela, who protested. "Consider it training," he said. and the softness in his voice made it seem less like a dismissal and more like a blessing. One afternoon, in the lull after the mediation, but before the donation checks cleared, the man who had sold the house, Robert, stopped by the porch. I had not thought to expect him. He stood at the gate like someone arriving late to their own funeral, hands in his pockets, eyes uncertain. We did not speak at once. The ocean filled the space between us with its steady inhale. "How is she?" he asked finally, nodding toward Angela, who was on the porch teaching a woman how to fold a blanket. "She is learning how to stand," I said. Robert's face moved through an expression that looked like remorse and something like relief. "I thought I'd fix things," he said. "I thought selling would be a clean cut." "You didn't know what you were dividing," I replied. "It was messy, and some things are messy because life is messy." He apologized in the small human way people do, without ceremony, without pageantry. He offered a quiet account of his own regrets, and then, before he left, took off his cap and set it on the table like a token. "I will come by when I can," he said, "if you'll have me." We did not know what to do with the offer, accept it. There is a way that time teaches us the shape of people. Some return to be part of the repair, some do not. Robert returned sometimes. He brought jars of homemade pickles and once a stack of old fishing maps with the edges worn soft. He helped Jonah lift a piece of lumber. He sat on the porch and listened. For Angela, the hardest part was not the legal work or the grant writing. It was learning that love, even when it had been violated, could be reoriented into a life that held other people. She learned to see the shelter not as a monument to the past, but as an instrument of future mercy. Her nights of crying lessened in frequency, if not in depth. Her voice acquired a new steadiness. She began to teach one night a week at the diner, offering a workshop on forms for everyday life, how to open a bank account, how to respond to a landlord, how to write a resume. People came, at first in ones and twos, then in a cluster, and each week someone would bring a pie. We learned also, slowly, that justice and gentleness are not opposites. Mr. Peterson, who once wielded the law as a weapon, now held it like a lantern. He taught a class on knowing your rights, and we filled the diner until chairs scraped the tile. People asked sharp questions, and he answered with clear sentences. He would say, "The law is not always merciful, but people can make it merciful by choosing how they use it." He started to volunteer at the shelter, drafting letters for those who needed to appeal benefits, and in those letters, he wrote carefully the facts and the faces. On a warm spring night, a year after we opened the porch light for the first time, we had a small celebration. Lanterns were strung between posts. Jonah's table won its raffle. Ruth brought honey from her bees. Angela stood and, for a few moments, could not speak. Then she told a story of a child who had forgotten the names of the stars and remembered them again. She thanked people for being a town that could love in public. We clapped until our palms warmed. The boy, Jamie, now less shy and more steady, stood on a crate and pointed to a patch of sky. "That's the old boat," he said, and the crowd laughed and then listened as he told them why the pattern felt like heading and hope. There were debts still to be paid, rules to be observed, the practical labor of keeping a place running. But there was also an array of small miracles, wanted and unwanted, that gathered like shells at low tide. A woman found work at the bakery across town and brought donuts for the shelter every Saturday. A retired teacher came once a month to tutor children. A young couple who had once been guests taught a sewing circle and mended coats for winter.